Okay, so there's been a whirlwind of news lately about healthcare policy, especially this thing everyone's calling the pharma tariff.
Right. And it's easy to just see tariff and think, okay, tax hike. But it's really not that simple at all.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It feels like navigating a maze, trying to figure out these tariffs, the pricing reforms tangled up with them.
Exactly. So today, we're going to try and unpack it. Look at what the policy actually says, how the markets reacted, which was kind of weird, honestly.
Definitely weird in places.
And, what it might mean for patients, for the companies, the whole global supply chain, really.
Yeah, because this isn't just a tax grab, is it? You were saying it's more about localization.
That seems to be the core driver. It looks like a deliberate push to get drug manufacturing, specifically for certain types of drugs happening in the U.S. It's an attempt to tackle that dependency on foreign supply chains we hear so much about.
Which then raises the big question for you listening. Who actually ends up paying for this shift?
Yeah.
And like you said, why did some giant pharma stocks actually climb when this was announced? Makes no sense on the surface.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with basics. What is the actual policy?
So the headline number is a 100% tariff. Pretty huge.
Massive. But when does it kick in?
October 1st, 2025. So there's a bit of lead time.
Okay, 100% tariff, October 25. But the critical thing, the detail that changes everything, is what it applies to.
Exactly. It's surgical. It only hits branded or patented drugs.
Right, which means...
Generics are completely off the hook. Totally exempt.
And that's enormous, right? Think about how much of the global drug supply, especially from places like India, is generics. That entire segment is just carved out, protected.
Huge shield for them.
Right.
But even for the branded stuff, the stuff that is targeted, there's a way out, isn't there?
Yes, and this is the other crucial piece, the escape clause. Companies can avoid that 100% hit if, and it's a biggest, they are actively building manufacturing plants in the U.S.
Actively building. So it's not just about planning to build or saying you'll build.
The language suggests it needs to be tangible. Construction underway. It's basically forcing a choice. Commit serious capital to building capacity in the U.S. or pay double for your imported branded drugs.
Which brings us straight to that bizarre market reaction, especially in the U.S. The government throws down this massive tariff threat, and boom, Eli Lilly, Merck, Pfizer, their shares go up. How?
Well, the market, or at least some investors, clearly saw past the headline tariff and read the fine print, specifically that escape clause.
They saw it not as a penalty, but as
What?
an opportunity.
Or maybe just a manageable cost of doing business, especially for them. Think about it. Big Pharma, the U.S. giants, they have the scale. They have the billions needed to invest in new plants.
Or they already had plans in the works anyway.
Exactly. Many likely did. So for them, this policy isn't an existential threat. It might even strengthen their position relative to smaller competitors who can't afford to build. They meet the requirement, avoid the tariff, and potentially gain market share from those locked out.
Okay, that makes sense for the U.S. giants. What about the big European players? AstraZeneca, GSK, Novartis, Roche, Sanofi. They dipped briefly, then bounced back too. Same reason.
Pretty much the same dynamic. They also have scale, existing U.S. presence, and ongoing investment plans. Novartis actually came out and confirmed, yeah, we've got construction projects happening in the U.S. right now, so they signal compliance.
But they have an extra wrinkle, don't they? The EU Trade Pact.
Right. That pact puts a ceiling on U.S. tariffs for EU pharma imports. It caps it at 15%.
15%. Now, okay, it's way better than 100%, no question. But calling it cushioned, 15% is still a significant new cost compared to zero before, isn't it? Especially if you're making billions in revenue.
That's a fair point. Cushion might be relative. 15% isn't nothing. But for these diversified giants, it's likely seen as absorbable, perhaps passed on, or just a cost they can manage within their global structure, especially if complying also avoids the much bigger 100% threat and maybe even helps streamline things long term.
But it does draw a sharp line between the giants and the smaller guys in Europe, right?
Absolutely. That's where the impact looks much more severe. Look at Novo Nordisk, down 11% initially. Genmab, Zealand Pharma. These smaller, often more specialized European firms took a real hit.
Why them specifically?
Scale, again. They likely lack the massive capital reserves to just decide to build a billion-dollar plant in the U.S. And even that 15% tariff under the EU Pact, that could seriously hurt their margins if they can't easily pass it on. They're far more vulnerable.
Okay, so U.S. and Euro giants, mostly resilient. Smaller Europeans feeling the pain. Let's pivot to Asia. The reaction there seemed much more negative across the board.
Yeah, it was a broader sell-off. In Japan, major names like Chugai, Daiichi Sankyo saw drops.
See China?
Similar story. Wuji Aptech down, Alibaba Health down. Now, it's important to remember China's current share of U.S. drug imports, especially branded ones, isn't huge, maybe around 4% currently.
So why the drop?
It's about the future. Any plans Chinese firms might have had to significantly expand their branded drug exports to the U.S. market just got a massive potential roadblock thrown in front of them. It chills future investment and expansion.
Got it. And India. We mentioned the generic exemption is huge for them.
It is. India was largely shielded because their strength is generics. Sun Pharma dipped a little, maybe 2.9%, so not totally immune to sentiment. But fundamentally, their core export business to the U.S. seems protected by that specific exemption.
Okay, let's drill down into the industry's official reaction. You've got this clear divide emerging between the big guys and the smaller ones.
Exactly. Big Pharma's public stance is essentially, we're good. They point to the massive investments already planned or underway in the U.S., something like $350 billion pledged this decade across the industry.
So they're basically saying, we meet the exemption criteria. This tariff doesn't really apply to us.
That's the message. They're using their scale and existing commitments as a shield, projecting stability.
But then, the flip side, this is where it gets really interesting and maybe worrying. The smaller biotechs. The innovators, often, but without the deep pockets.
Yeah, this is the critical stress point. These small and mid-sized firms, maybe they have one or two really promising drugs, often for rare diseases. They rely heavily on contract manufacturers, often overseas.
Because building their own cutting-edge manufacturing facility costs, what, hundreds of millions?
Easily. It's a massive capital expenditure. They simply don't have that kind of cash lying around, especially not to build speculative capacity in the U.S. just to avoid a potential future tariff.
And the industry itself is acknowledging this, right?
Oh, yeah. A major trade group put out a statement warning that these tariffs could, and I quote, devastate small and mid-sized biotech firms. It's not theoretical. For them, this isn't just an inconvenience. It could be an existential threat.
Imagine pouring everything into R&D for a breakthrough drug and then realizing you can't afford to manufacture it accessibly for the U.S. market because of this policy.
It's a really tough spot. They need that U.S. market, but the cost of entry just potentially skyrocketed.
So what are the analysts saying? When the people who crunch numbers for a living look at this, do they agree with Big Pharma that the impact is limited? Or do they see the risk for the smaller players?
Well, there's a bit of a split, but the consensus seems to lean towards limited overall impact, largely because of the exemptions for Big Pharma. Capital Economics, for example, said the impact is not as big as it looks, precisely because of those escape clauses.
Okay.
And Bernstein had a similar take, calling the outcome pretty good for Big Pharma. Their view was the tariff comes with that get-out-of-jail-free card, the investment option.
So they see it less as a punitive tax and more like a new regulatory hurdle that favors the incumbents.
Exactly. A mandated investment cost for U.S. market access, which the big players can afford.
But, and this seems like this whole system relies on the government actually verifying that companies are building, right? How does that even work?
Now you've hit the nail on the head. Enforcement. That's the massive question mark hanging over all of this. A BMO analyst raised exactly this concern.
Because a factory isn't built overnight.
Not even close. It takes years. Years from groundbreaking until you're actually producing validated, approved drugs at scale. So how does a regulator verify active building in a meaningful way?
Do they check foundation pouring, steel deliveries? What if a company starts, then stalls? Do they suddenly owe back tariffs?
Precisely. What are the milestones? How is progress audited? It creates this huge gray area, massive regulatory uncertainty. And Morningstar pointed out another angle. What about companies in, say, the UK or Switzerland? Close allies, sophisticated manufacturing. Could they get caught if the exemption rules are written too narrowly?
Yeah, the implementation details seem incredibly tricky. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. The ultimate question for many people listening: does this raise prices for me, the patient?
It's the crucial question. For most drugs from the big companies, your blockbusters, your common prescriptions, probably not. Or not directly because of this tariff anyway. They're shielded by the investment exemption.
Okay, so big pharma drugs likely stable. Where's the potential pinch?
It goes back to those smaller biotechs, the ones making specialty drugs, often for smaller patient populations. If they can't afford to build in the U.S. and get hit with that 100% tariff...
They have to pass that cost on somehow or go out of business.
Exactly. They don't have the diverse portfolios or massive profits of big pharma to absorb it. So for those niche, often expensive specialty drugs, Yes, there's a real risk the cost gets passed on to insurers and ultimately potentially to patients through higher co-pays or premiums.
And how are the insurance companies likely to react to this uncertainty? Are they just going to wait and see?
Unlikely. Insurers hate uncertainty. They're probably already modeling this out. If they anticipate rising costs for certain specialty drugs due to tariffs, you could see them react preemptively.
Like tightening up coverage.
Yeah, possibly. They might revisit their drug formularies, the list of drugs they cover. They could become more aggressive in pushing patients towards generics or biosimilars where available. They might require more prior authorizations or step therapy for expensive branded drugs, especially those from potentially tariff-impacted smaller firms.
So the ripple effect could mean more hurdles for patients needing specific, newer therapies from smaller companies.
That's the concern, yes. Particularly during this transition period leading up to the 2025 deadline and potentially beyond as the enforcement questions linger.
Okay, let's follow that supply chain thread.
Yeah.
If the small biotechs can't afford to build their own plants, they rely on partners, right? These CDMOs, contract development and manufacturing organizations?
Yep, the CDMOs are the outsourced backbone for a lot of drug development and manufacturing. They handle everything from making the basic ingredients, the APIs, to complex biologics production. Crucial partners.
So are they hit by the tariff, or are they insulated?
Generally, the view is they're largely insulated from the direct cost of the tariff, at least in the short term. Morningstar DBRS, for instance, expects them to be mostly okay.
Why is that?
Their contracts with the pharma companies, their clients, often have pass-through clauses, meaning if a tariff gets imposed on the drug they're making for Biotech X, it's Biotech X's responsibility to cover that cost, not the CDMOs. Their revenue stream is generally protected by the contract terms.
Okay, so their income is stable. But does the uncertainty around the tariff affect their business?
Yes, that's the catch. While their existing contracts might be safe, future growth could take a hit. You're seeing some CDMOs, like Pharma, already warning about a potential slowdown in, say, fiscal 2026.
Because their clients, the biotechs, are hitting pause.
Exactly. If you're a small biotech and you're facing this huge uncertainty about tariffs and market access, you might delay signing that big new manufacturing contract. You wait and see how the policy shakes out, how enforcement works. That delay slows down growth for the CDMOs.
Makes sense. But long term, could this actually be an opportunity for some CDMOs?
It could, yeah. Especially for CDMOs that already have a significant manufacturing footprint inside the U.S.
Because if the policy successfully pushes companies to manufacture more in the U.S.,
they might turn to U.S.-based CDMOs to do it rather than building themselves. So those with existing U.S. capacity or strong partnerships could actually see a boost in demand down the road as clients look to reshore or at least nearshore their manufacturing for the U.S. market.
Okay, so the tariff is disruptive, creates winners and losers, lots of uncertainty, but we need to put it in context because there's another huge policy pressure looming over the industry, arguably even bigger, drug pricing reform.
Absolutely. The tariff is a potential shock, especially for some, but pricing reform, that's a fundamental structural shift to the whole business model. It's potentially a much bigger deal long term.
And the main driver there is the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, from 2022.
That's the big one right now. The IRA gives Medicare the power to negotiate prices directly on some of the highest spending drugs. Those negotiations are starting, and the first negotiated prices are set to take effect in January 2026.
So right around the same time the tariff potentially kicks in. A double whammy?
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
The IRA isn't a maybe, it's law. It will lead to lower prices for some blockbuster drugs paid for by Medicare. That means direct margin compression for the manufacturers of those drugs.
And that's not all on the pricing front, is it? There's also this most favored nation idea.
Right. There was a more recent executive order pushing for MFN, most favored nation pricing. The basic idea is the U.S. government shouldn't pay more for a drug than the lowest price paid by other comparable wealthy nations.
So demanding the best international price.
Essentially, yes. It introduces international reference pricing. Companies were given a deadline, September 29th, to commit to this principle. It adds another layer of downward pressure on prices, or at least aims to.
Okay, so let's synthesize this because it feels crucial. You've got the tariff potentially forcing companies, especially smaller ones, to spend huge amounts of money just to build in the U.S.
While at the exact same time, pricing reforms like the IRA and MFN are chipping away at the potential profits they could make from selling those drugs in the U.S. market anyway.
It seems like an impossible squeeze for a small biotech, doesn't it? Spend billions to enter a market where your price is about to be negotiated down anyway.
That's the fear. It makes the economics incredibly challenging for companies without massive scale or diverse portfolios. Big Pharma might weather it, they can afford the investment, and maybe the negotiated price is still profitable enough. But for a small company banking on one or two drugs, it looks really tough.
And insurers will react to this pricing pressure too, presumably.
Oh, absolutely. Faced with negotiated prices under IRA and potentially MFN, insurers will likely double down on strategies like reference pricing themselves, tighten formularies further, and push even harder for generics and biosimilars wherever possible to control their own costs.
Okay, so bringing this all together, the tariff-forcing localization, the pricing reforms, squeezing margins, who comes out ahead and who gets left behind in this new landscape?
Well, the clearest potential winners seem to be the established big pharma companies, particularly those that already have a strong U.S. manufacturing presence and significant ongoing investment.
They avoid the tariff and have the scale to manage the pricing pressures, relatively speaking.
Right. And they also have the resources to keep investing in the next wave of innovation, things like gene therapy, mRNA, AI, and drug discovery areas that might command higher prices initially and fall outside immediate negotiation targets.
Losers. Or those most at risk.
It really looks like the small and mid-sized biotechs are in the toughest spot, especially those heavily reliant on overseas manufacturing and maybe only having one or two products in the pipeline. They face both the capital barrier from the tariff and the margin pressure from pricing reform.
And potentially patients who rely on the niche drugs those smaller companies produce.
That's a definite risk, yeah. If those companies struggle or if costs get passed on, access to those specific specialty or rare disease treatments could become more difficult or expensive.
Despite all this pressure, though, the overall healthcare sector tends to be resilient, doesn't it?
It does, fundamentally. The long-term drivers are still there. Aging populations worldwide, the prevalence of chronic diseases, the constant need for innovation. That underlying demand provides a strong base.
And the market seems to reflect some of that. You mentioned valuations.
Yeah, the pharma and biotech sector has been trading at a pretty significant discount compared to the broader market like the S&P 500. Maybe around a 40% discount, sometimes more.
Suggesting the market has priced in a lot of this policy risk already.
Quite possibly. It suggests that for investors with a long-term view who can handle the volatility and understand the policy risks, there might be value opportunities in the sector, especially if you're diversified. But the policy constraints are absolutely real and shaping the landscape.
Which leads us perfectly into a final thought for you, our listeners, to mull over. We're seeing this intense push-pull. On one side, innovation driving growth, finding new cures. On the other, policy constraints forcing localization, controlling prices. Over the next decade, which force do you think will ultimately have the bigger impact on the future of medicine and global health access? Something to consider.
And before we sign off, just the necessary reminder. We are not certified financial advisors, and this content is only for educational purposes. If you are considering making any investment decisions, please be sure to consult with a certified financial advisor.